At 4:21 on the morning of April 9, 1940, a 64-year-old Norwegian artillery officer named Birger Eriksson stood on a small island fortress in the Oslofjord and watched something move toward him in the dark that should not have been there. A column of warships, no lights, no signal, no declaration of any kind. They were running silent up the narrow throat of the fjord toward the capital of a country that was not at war, and the largest of them was a heavy cruiser displacing more than 14,000 tons, brand new, the pride of a modern navy, gliding through the black water as if it owned it. The place where Eriksson waited was called Oscarsborg, and it sat in the Drøbak Narrows, the single tightest point of the entire fjord, where the deep water channel squeezes down to a few hundred meters. Any ship that wanted to reach Oslo from the sea had to pass through that gap, slow, exposed, within arm's reach of the guns. The fortress had been built there for exactly this reason, generations earlier, when the threat was a different empire and the guns were the most modern in the world. By 1940, they were not modern at all. The two great cannons that pointed out across the channel had been forged by Krupp in the 1890s, half a century before, and Norwegian gunners had given them names the way men name things they have lived alongside for a long time. Moses. Aaron. There was a third, Josva, but there were not enough trained men that night to crew all three. Eriksson had no orders to fire. Let that sink in, because it is the hinge on which the entire morning turns. Norway was neutral. No one had told the fortress that a war had begun, because the men in Oslo who might have told him were still asleep, or still arguing, or still clinging to the hope that the shapes coming up the fjord were British vessels, or a navigation error, or anything at all other than what they so obviously were. The standing procedure when an unidentified ship approached was to fire a warning shot, to signal, to demand identification, to give the intruder a chance to explain itself. That was the cautious, lawful, career-preserving thing to do. Eriksson did not fire a warning shot. He looked at the cruiser filling the channel in front of him, and he made a decision that no regulation authorized and no superior had sanctioned. A decision that an entire nation's survival would turn on without anyone in that nation yet knowing it. He is reported to have told the men around him that he would either be decorated or court-martialed for what he was about to do, and then he gave the order to open fire for effect. Not a warning. The real thing. Moses and Aaron fired into the side of the cruiser. Blucher across a few hundred meters of water, so close that the gunners could not have missed if they tried. The heavy shells tore into her superstructure and her hull. And then, hidden in the rocks below the fortress on a smaller island, an old torpedo battery that most people had assumed was obsolete came to life. It was run that night by another aging officer, a man recalled from retirement, firing torpedoes that had been manufactured around the turn of the century. Two of those antique torpedoes ran true and struck the Blucher below the waterline. The cruiser, mortally hit, began to burn and list, and within hours she rolled over and went to the bottom of the Oslofjord, taking with her hundreds of men and something more valuable than men. She had been carrying the administrative core of the German occupation, the officials, the police, the bureaucrats who were meant to step ashore in Oslo at dawn and take over the machinery of the Norwegian state in a single clean stroke. That stroke failed. The seizure of Oslo from the sea, the part of the plan that was supposed to decapitate Norway before breakfast, fell apart in the Drøbak Narrows under the guns of a fortress everyone had written off. The delay that Eriksson bought was measured in hours, not days. But those hours were the difference between a country whose government, parliament, king and gold reserve were captured intact in their capital, and a country whose king and government slipped out by train to the north and then into exile, carrying with them the legitimacy of the Norwegian state and the refusal to surrender. Because the head of the country was not captured that morning, Norway did not capitulate that morning. The war went on. Now hold that scene, because everything we are about to discuss lives inside the question it raises. One old man on an island with cannons older than most of his soldiers and torpedoes older than that, sinking the newest cruiser of a modern fleet in the dark on his own authority, with no orders against the regulations, because he understood in that moment what no one above him had yet admitted. Was that the act of a great army? Or was it the act of one extraordinary individual improvising brilliantly in the collapse of an army that was never ready for the morning it was about to face? Because that, precisely, is the trap inside today's question. Which Nordic army was actually the best? Finland, Sweden, or Norway? It sounds like a clean question, the kind you could settle with a chart. It is nothing of the sort. These three small northern nations, bound together by language and weather and a shared history of hardship at the edge of Europe, walked into the Second World War along three completely different roads. One of them fought the largest land army on the face of the earth, not once but twice, and came out the other side still free. One of them was overrun in a matter of weeks and spent the rest of the war fighting from the sea and the shadows. And one of them never fired a single shot in anger across the entire conflict, and may, for that very reason, have ended the war with the most intact, best equipped and most professional fighting force of the three. So this is not really a story about who had the most tanks or the biggest budget. This is a story about how you actually measure an army. Not by its parades, not by its paper strength, not by the medals on its officers' chests, but by what it did when the test came, and by the haunting, unanswerable question of what an army was worth when the test never came at all. Three nations, three armies, three completely different wars, or in one case, no war at all. And the genuinely difficult, genuinely fascinating problem of deciding which of them, in the end, deserves to be called the best. Let us begin where the morning began, with Norway, because Norway's war starts on that island in the fjord, and it starts with a hard truth that Norwegians themselves have spent the better part of a century reckoning with. Norway in the spring of 1940 was a nation that had quietly convinced itself it would never have to fight again. It had stayed neutral through the First World War, and it had emerged from that catastrophe prosperous, intact, and confirmed in a comfortable belief that neutrality itself was a kind of shield, that a small, peaceful country at the edge of the continent could simply decline to take part in Europe's madness and be left alone. It was a seductive idea. It was also, by April of 1940, a fatal one. Through the 1920s and the 1930s, that belief expressed itself in budgets, and the budgets told the real story. Year after year, Norwegian defense spending was trimmed and trimmed again. The army that existed on paper was what is called a mobilization army, which is a polite way of saying that in peacetime it barely existed at all. The plan was that when danger came, the alarm would be raised. The reservists scattered across the farms and the towns and the fishing villages would receive their call-up notices, and out of the civilian population a real army would crystallize, take up its weapons and march to the border. It is not a foolish system in principle. Plenty of small nations have relied on it, but it depends utterly on two things that an enemy will almost never agree to provide. It depends on warning, and it depends on time. On the 9th of April 1940, Germany gave Norway neither. Operation Weserübung was one of the most audacious and frankly reckless amphibious gambles of the entire war, an attempt to seize an entire long coastline in a single coordinated morning, striking simultaneously at every port that mattered, from Oslo in the south to Kristiansand, to Bergen, to Trondheim in the center, all the way up to Narvik, far above the Arctic Circle. To do this, Germany committed nearly the whole of its surface navy and threw it across waters dominated by the Royal Navy, betting everything on speed and surprise and the sheer nerve of the thing. In most places, the bet paid off. Norwegian soldiers and townspeople woke on a quiet spring morning to discover that the enemy was already in their streets, already in their harbours, already ashore before a single defensive line had formed. The mobilization, the whole basis of Norwegian defence, dissolved into confusion in those first hours. The call-up notices that were supposed to summon the reserves were, in the chaos and the disbelief, in many cases simply put into the ordinary post, mailed out as if there were days to spare when there were not even hours. The men who were meant to hold the fjords and the mountain valleys were scattered, uncertain, and in countless cases genuinely did not know whether their country was at war or not. An army that depends on time was given none. An army that depends on warning was caught asleep. And yet, this is the precise point at which Norway's record stops being a simple story of collapse and becomes something far more interesting. Because alongside the chaos, scattered through it like sparks, there were moments of equality that any army on the planet would have been proud to claim. Oscarsborg was the most famous, but it was very far from the only one. At a forgotten old fortress called Hegra in the country's centre, a Norwegian force gathered itself in the days after the invasion, dug into the frozen rock of a position the Germans had already swept past, and simply refused to leave. For weeks, under artillery fire and air attack, cut off and surrounded and strategically irrelevant, that garrison held, long after the larger campaign around them had moved on, an island of stubborn defiance in an occupied country. In the long mountain valleys of central Norway, hastily assembled Norwegian units, joined by British troops who had been rushed across the North Sea into a campaign nobody had prepared for, fought delaying actions against German mountain troops and German armour. They had almost nothing, no real anti-tank weapons, little artillery, no air cover worth the name, the Luftwaffe ruling the sky above them unchallenged. But they traded ground for time, falling back through the snow valley by valley, making the enemy pay for every kilometre in a way that the planners in Berlin had not budgeted for. It was in the far north, though, at Narvik, that the Norwegian campaign produced its single most dangerous moment for Germany, the moment when the whole northern adventure nearly came apart in German hands. Narvik was the prize that mattered most because it was the ice-free port through which Swedish iron ore reached German industry through the winter, and the German general Eduard Dietl had taken it on the first morning with a force of elite mountain troops carried in by destroyers. But having taken it, Dietl was then trapped. He was thousands of kilometers from any support at the top of the world, and the Royal Navy descended on the destroyers that had brought him. In two savage battles in the waters off Narvik on the 10th and the 13th of April, the British annihilated the German destroyer force. Every single one of the 10 ships committed to the operation sunk or wrecked in exchange for losses of their own. Dietl's mountain troops were now stranded, reinforced only by the shipwrecked sailors of their own sunken fleet fighting for survival. Through the weeks that followed, a combined Allied force, Norwegian soldiers fighting in their own mountains alongside French Foreign Legionnaires, Polish troops and British units, closed in on Dietl and pressed him back kilometre by kilometre until by the end of May, his exhausted men had been pushed nearly to the Swedish frontier, and the German command was seriously confronting the prospect that the entire northern force would be destroyed or driven across the border into internment. On the 28th of May 1940, the Allies recaptured Narvik itself. For a few days, in one frozen corner of an otherwise triumphant German spring, Germany was losing. And then France collapsed and none of it could be saved. The disaster unfolding in Western Europe swallowed every available Allied soldier, and the force at Narvik, victorious but suddenly irrelevant, was withdrawn and shipped south to a continent that was falling apart. The Norwegians, abandoned not by cowardice but by the brutal arithmetic of a wider catastrophe, could not hold the north alone. Organized resistance on the mainland ended on the 10th of June 1940. The Norwegian army, in the conventional sense of the word, had been beaten. 62 days from the morning in the fjord to the end. If the story of the Norwegian army ended there on the 10th of June, the verdict would be straightforward and a little melancholy. An underfunded, underprepared, neglected force, starved of money and warning for 2 decades, capable of flashes of real brilliance but beaten in 2 months by an enemy that had simply done its homework better. But the story does not end there, and this is where the comparison we are attempting gets genuinely complicated, because Norway's largest and most important military contribution to the defeat of Germany had almost nothing to do with its army at all. There is, first, the matter of the king. When the Germans demanded that King Haakon VII appoint a collaborationist government under the traitor Vidkun Quisling and lend the occupation the legitimacy of the crown, the king refused. He told his cabinet that he would abdicate rather than appoint a government he could not respect, and in doing so, he freed them to keep fighting and to carry the lawful Norwegian state into exile. It is remembered as the King's No, and it mattered because it meant that the war Norway lost on the battlefield it never conceded in principle. The state did not surrender, it relocated, and it relocated with a weapon that the army never possessed. Norway in 1940 owned one of the largest and most modern merchant fleets in the entire world, an enormous share of it consisting of exactly the modern tankers that the Allied war effort would soon need more desperately than almost anything else. When the government went into exile, it gathered those scattered ships, wherever in the world they happened to be on the morning of the invasion, into a single state-run shipping organization, and it placed that fleet at the service of the Allies. Some have called it the fourth service of the Norwegian War, standing alongside the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, and the description is not an exaggeration. Norwegian ships and Norwegian crews carried the oil and the cargo that kept Britain breathing across the deadliest waters of the war, year upon year, through the worst of the U-boat campaign. And the men who crewed them died for it in numbers the soldiers of 1940 never came close to. If you ask, honestly, what Norway contributed to the destruction of Hitler's Germany, the truthful answer is not the 2 months of fighting in the snow, heroic as parts of it were. It is the long, grinding, unglamorous years of fuel and freight hauled across an ocean that was doing everything in its power to send those sailors to the bottom. And there was the resistance at home, the secret army that grew quietly in the occupied country, eventually organizing tens of thousands of trained men and women for the day of liberation. There was the intelligence flowing back to London, the sabotage, the refusal to be governed. And there was, most famously of all, the operation that has become a legend in its own right, when a small team of Norwegian commandos, trained in Britain and dropped onto a frozen mountain plateau, infiltrated and destroyed the heavy water production facility at Vemork and crippled the German nuclear program at a single stroke. That story is large enough to deserve its own telling, and it has had it on this very channel. But notice what it reveals about the Norwegian way of war once the conventional army was gone. When they could no longer win as a regular army in the field, they did not stop. They became something else, saboteurs, sailors, shadows on a mountainside. So what is the honest verdict on Norway? A conventional army beaten quickly because it had been starved of money and starved of warning for 20 years, and because no amount of last-minute courage can manufacture the preparation that 2 decades of neglect destroyed. But also a nation and an army capable of extraordinary individual and improvised brilliance under the worst possible circumstances, from one old man on an island to a garrison clinging to a rock at Hegra, to a few commandos on a plateau, to a fleet of sailors who simply would not stop sailing into the torpedoes. Brave, resourceful, catastrophically unprepared, defeated decisively on the battlefield, and yet, measured across the full span of the war, very far from useless. Remember that combination, because we are going to have to weigh it against 2 very different kinds of record. Now we turn to the strangest case of the 3, the one that quietly sabotages every neat attempt to answer the question. Because to judge this army at all, we have to judge a force that never went to war. Sweden in 1940 had not fought a campaign in any meaningful sense for well over a century. The last time Swedish soldiers had marched to war was in 1814, in the dying days of the Napoleonic era. Stop and absorb what that actually means. By the time the Second World War set fire to the world on every side of it, Sweden had enjoyed more than 125 years of unbroken peace, the longest continuous run of peace of any nation in Europe. To the east, Finland was being invaded by the Soviet Union. To the west, Denmark fell in a single day, and Norway burned for 2 months. And in the middle of it all sat Sweden, mobilized, armed, watching its neighbors bleed, and not touched. Here is the paradox that makes Sweden impossible to wave away. By a number of concrete measures, Sweden may well have possessed the most capable standing military force of the three. It had something that neither Finland nor Norway had in anything like the same degree. It had money and it had industry. Sweden in 1940 was a wealthy, technologically advanced nation with a serious domestic arms industry. And the jewel of that industry was the Bofors Company, whose weapons were so good that the Allies themselves, the British and the Americans, bought them and built them under license and bolted them onto warships and dragged them across battlefields on every front of the war. The Bofors anti-aircraft gun became one of the most widely used weapons of its kind on the planet, and it was Swedish. That is not the achievement of a backward little country. That is the achievement of a first-class industrial and engineering power. And crucially, that entire industrial machine survived the war perfectly intact because nothing of it was ever bombed, blockaded into starvation or overrun. So while the Norwegian army was being scattered through the mountain valleys and the Finnish army was bleeding into the snow of the Karelian forests, the Swedish army was doing something quieter and, in pure material terms, more impressive. It was mobilizing. Over the war years, Sweden built up its forces into a large, well-equipped, well-supplied, professionally organized army, hundreds of thousands of men under arms, backed by its own tanks, its own aircraft, its own artillery, all of it produced or sustained by an economy that the war never broke. And then, having built this force, Sweden did the one thing that makes it so maddening to assess. It waited. It stood in the middle of the storm, fully armed, and never struck a blow. This is the great unanswerable question at the heart of Nordic military history, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than dodged. How good was the Swedish army, really? We do not know. We cannot know, because the army was never tested in the only way an army can ever truly be tested. We can say with confidence that it was large. We can say it was well armed by the standards of small nations, better armed in many respects than either of its neighbors. We can say it was organized, disciplined, and led by professionals. But here is the iron law that the entire war keeps teaching us over and over. Paper strength and real strength are not the same thing, and the only exchange rate between the two is combat. The Norwegian army looked weak on paper, and it produced Oscarsborg and Narvik. The Finnish army, as we are about to see, looked utterly hopeless on paper, and it humiliated a superpower. Until the shells are actually falling on your own positions and your own men, you simply do not know what you have. Sweden never found out. It is the central, frustrating fact of the Swedish case. And neutrality, it has to be said clearly, was not free, and it was not always clean. This is the part of the Swedish story that sits uncomfortably, and an honest accounting cannot skip past it. To stay out of the war, surrounded for years by a triumphant and menacing Germany, Sweden made compromises that materially helped the German war machine. Swedish iron ore continued to flow south to feed German industry throughout the conflict, shipped out through the Baltic in the warmer months and through the Norwegian port of Narvik when the Baltic froze, and German steel production leaned heavily on that ore. Without it, the German war economy would have been in serious trouble. That oar was, in a real sense, a Swedish contribution to the German cause, however reluctantly given. And in the summer of 1941, with Germany at the peak of its power and about to hurl itself at the Soviet Union, Sweden agreed to let a fully equipped German division cross Swedish territory by railway, moving from occupied Norway through neutral Sweden to the Finnish front to take part in the invasion of Russia. The decision tore at the very meaning of the word neutrality, and Swedes argued over it bitterly at the time, and have argued over it ever since. The defenders of the policy made an argument that is not without force. A small nation encircled by a victorious Germany, they said, had no realistic choice but to bend. That bending was the price of not being broken, and that a whole, undamaged, independent Sweden was worth more to the post-war world and to its own neighbours than a heroic, conquered, devastated one would have been. There is genuine weight to that argument. A neutral Sweden could shelter refugees, and it did, taking in the Danish Jews when Germany moved to deport them, and giving refuge to Norwegians and others fleeing the occupation. A neutral Sweden could quietly train soldiers for its occupied neighbours, and it did, hosting Norwegian and Danish forces in waiting on its soil under the polite fiction that they were police. As the war turned, Sweden tilted steadily toward the Allies, restricting the German transit traffic, sharing intelligence, hardening its posture. Neutrality in Swedish hands was not passive. It was a continuous, calculated, deeply uncomfortable balancing act performed on a knife's edge for 6 years, and the country came through it whole. But here is the thing that I think tips the moral scale, and it tells you something important about the Swedish soldier that the official policy of neutrality hides. When Finland was fighting for its very existence against the Soviet invasion in the Winter War, thousands of Swedes refused to wait for their government's permission to do what they believed was right. They volunteered. A corps of Swedish volunteers, thousands strong, joined by men from across Scandinavia, crossed into Finland and took up positions in the frozen far north on the Salla front and faced the Red Army directly, holding a sector of the line and freeing Finnish units to fight where they were needed most. The Swedish state stayed scrupulously neutral. A great many individual Swedes did not. And that fact matters enormously for our question, because it tells you the fighting spirit was there, the willingness was there, the capability was there in the men themselves. What was missing from the Swedish story was not courage and not competence. What was missing was the war itself, the test that would have told us once and for all and beyond argument how good the Swedish army really was. So the verdict on Sweden is the single hardest one in this entire comparison to write down. By equipment, by industry, by organization, by the sheer fact that it ended the war intact and undamaged while both of its neighbors had been shattered and occupied, Sweden may genuinely have fielded the strongest standing force of the three. But an army's reputation is earned only in contact with the enemy, and the Swedish army's contact with the enemy as an army never came. It is the undefeated fighter who never once entered the ring. You cannot, in honesty, crown a champion who never fought a bout, but you also cannot, in honesty, claim that he would have lost. Hold that thought too, because it is going to matter when we add everything up. Which brings us, at last, to Finland. And here, for the first time, the fog of speculation finally burns away, because Finland's claim to the title does not rest on what might have been, or could have been, or would have been if only. It rests entirely and without qualification on what actually was. Everything you really need to understand about the Finnish army is contained in a single comparison that, even now, even knowing the outcome, sounds barely believable. In the late autumn of 1939, the Soviet Union, the largest land power on the face of the earth, invaded Finland along a front more than 1,000 kilometers long, with hundreds of thousands of men in the first wave, with thousands of tanks, with thousands of aircraft. Finland faced this with a small army, a large part of it reservists called up in the preceding weeks, with almost no tanks of its own, almost no modern aircraft, and almost no anti-tank weapons in any meaningful quantity. The disparity in armor alone ran at something close to 100-to-1. In Moscow, the planners predicted that the whole affair would be finished in under a fortnight. The Red Army Band, it was said, should pack its instruments for the victory parade. The Winter War lasted 3.5 months, and it came within an inch of destroying the reputation of the Red Army in front of the watching world. The Finns achieved this with the one thing that no budget can purchase and no factory can stamp out. They did it with adaptation, with an understanding of their own country so total and so intimate that no invading army could possibly match it. They turned the endless forests, the frozen lakes, the 18-hour darkness, and above all the appalling cold into weapons of war. They developed a method of fighting, the famous Motti tactics, in which small, fast, ski-borne units would allow the massive Soviet road columns to push deep into the forest, and then sever those columns at multiple points at once, cutting the enemy into isolated, freezing, starving fragments and destroying each one in turn in the dark. The most infamous example came on the Rajate road near a place called Suomussalmi, where a Finnish force, a fraction of the size of its enemy, cut an entire Soviet division to pieces along a frozen forest track, leaving a corridor of wrecked vehicles and frozen men kilometers long, one of the most lopsided defeats inflicted on any army in the entire war. The Finns produced a sniper lying alone in the snow in a white smock who killed hundreds of Soviet soldiers by himself before the war was out. They produced defensive stands at places like Kola, where vastly outnumbered units simply would not break, and the phrase that came back from the line, that Kola holds, became a small immortal sentence in Finnish memory. They produced commanders, above all the old Field Marshal Mannerheim, who understood the one principle that the entire war turned on, which is that you do not defeat a giant by standing still in front of him and trading blows you cannot afford. You make the giant exhaust itself in terrain it cannot comprehend, freeze it, isolate it, bleed it, and let the country itself do half the killing. The Winter War ended in the spring of 1940 in a harsh peace that cost Finland more than 1/10 of its territory, including its second city and the whole of the Karelian Isthmus, because in the end, no amount of brilliance could permanently overcome that crushing imbalance of mass and men and machines. But the Soviet Union paid for that territory in blood at a rate that stunned every observer on the planet, suffering casualties many times those of the defenders, and the spectacle of the world's largest army being humiliated by a nation of fewer than 4 million people rang out across Europe. It rang out fatefully in Berlin, where it helped persuade Hitler that the Red Army was a hollow, rotten giant that would collapse at a hard kick. That was a catastrophic misreading, as Germany would discover at terrible cost the following year. But it was a misreading earned entirely and single-handedly by the Finnish soldier on his skis in the snow. And then, and this is the part that truly secures Finland's claim, Finland did it again. In 1941, as Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Finland went to war with the Soviets a second time, in what the Finns call the Continuation War, to recover what had been torn from them the year before. They drove the Soviets back, retook their lost Karelia, and then the front settled into a long static stalemate that held for nearly 3 years. And then came the summer of 1944, and the test that towers over everything else in this story. By the summer of 1944, the Red Army was no longer the stumbling giant of 1939. It had been forged in the furnace of 3 years of war against the Wehrmacht into the most powerful land army on earth, a juggernaut that was at that very moment tearing the German army to shreds across the whole length of the Eastern Front. And in June of 1944, that juggernaut turned its full, refined, overwhelming strength against Finland in a massive offensive designed to knock the country out of the war once and for all, and to do to Finland what it was doing to everyone else, which was to crush it flat. The Soviets broke through, took back the lost ground, recaptured the city of Viborg, and the steamroller that had not been stopped by anyone, anywhere, on any front that year, bore down on the heart of Finland. And the Finns stopped it. At a place called Tali-Ihantala, in the last days of June and the first days of July 1944, the Finnish army fought what remains to this day the largest battle in the history of the Nordic countries, an enormous, grinding, desperate defensive battle against a Soviet force far larger than its own. With the line bending and threatening to break, with German emergency aid arriving in the form of new anti-tank weapons and assault guns and air support, the Finnish army held. It did not merely survive. It halted on its own soil the same Red Army offensive machine that was simultaneously demolishing the German Army Group Center hundreds of kilometers to the south. The cost it inflicted was high enough, and the line it held was firm enough, that the Soviet High Command concluded that the conquest of Finland was simply not worth the price, broke off the offensive, and shifted its strength toward the Baltic and toward Germany. Finland forced an armistice on terms it could live with. There is not 1 ounce of speculation in any of that. There is no paper strength to discount, no untested potential to imagine into existence. There is only the record, hard and documented. And the record did not even stop there, because the armistice with the Soviets came with a bitter condition. Finland was required to drive its former German co-belligerents out of the country's far north, and so the Finnish army, having just fought the Soviets to a standstill, turned around and fought a third campaign in 5 years, this time against the German army in the Lapland War, pushing the Germans out of Finland while they burned the province behind them in a scorched earth retreat. So count it up, 3 wars in 5 years, against the largest army on earth twice, and then against the German army. And at the end of all of it, when the smoke cleared and the maps were redrawn, there stood Finland, still independent, still unoccupied, still governing itself, still a democracy. This is the fact that towers over the entire comparison, and, frankly, over much of the war. Of all the small nations that shared a border with the Soviet Union, Finland is the one that fought it twice, and that came out the far side with its sovereignty intact. The Baltic states, its neighbors across the water, were simply swallowed whole and erased from the map for half a century. The nations of Eastern Europe were absorbed one after another into the Soviet sphere. Finland alone kept its freedom by force of arms and force of will, and then kept it through the long Cold War that followed. By the only test an army can ever truly be given, the test of combat against a real and overwhelming enemy over a sustained period of years, the Finnish army did not merely pass. It passed under conditions that should, by every reasonable calculation, have been impossible. So now we have to actually answer the question, and answering it honestly means admitting up front that there is more than one way to measure an army, and that these 3 are not even standing on the same scale to begin with. Let us be fair to all 3 before we decide. If you measure by raw material strength, by equipment, by industry, by the cold hard quality of a standing force in being, then Sweden has a real and serious claim. It was the richest of the 3, the best supplied, in some respects the most modern, the only one with a true first-class arms industry of its own, and it ended the war whole and undamaged while the other 2 lay shattered. On a parade ground in 1945, the Swedish army would very likely have been the most impressive of the 3 by a wide margin. But it never fired a shot in anger as an army, and an army that has never fought is, in the end, a hypothesis. A very promising hypothesis, but a hypothesis all the same. If you measure by courage in the face of catastrophe, by the capacity to wring extraordinary moments out of impossible situations, then Norway has a real and serious claim. Oscarsborg in the dark. The annihilation of the German destroyers at Narvik and the near destruction of Dietl's whole force. The garrison clinging to the rock at Hegra. the sailors of the merchant fleet dying year after year in the Atlantic, the commandos on the plateau. Pound for pound, in its very best moments, the Norwegian effort produced acts of brilliance and sacrifice that any nation on earth would be proud to put in its history books. But its conventional army was starved before the war even began, and it was beaten in the field in 62 days. And brilliance in defeat, however moving, however genuinely heroic, is still, at the end of the accounting, defeat. But if you measure an army the way wars are actually decided, by sustained performance against a real and powerful enemy over time, by the brutal ability to absorb everything the strongest power on earth can throw at you and still be standing on your own soil when it is over, then there is only one answer, and it is not close, and it is not really in doubt. Finland. Not because the Finns were braver than the Norwegians, who did not lack for courage in any way. Not because they were better equipped than the Swedes, because in pure material terms they plainly were not. But because they were tested in the hardest manner an army can ever be tested, repeatedly over years, against the worst odds imaginable, and they delivered a result that the other two were simply never asked to attempt, and that almost no army in the entire world of any size could have delivered. Think of it as three fighters. The Swede was the powerful, well-trained, beautifully equipped contender who, for reasons of survival and circumstance, never once stepped into the ring. We can admire his condition. We can never know his record. The Norwegian stepped into the ring, fought with tremendous heart, landed 2 or 3 stunning blows that no one expected, and was knocked down and counted out. And the Finn stepped into the ring against an opponent 3 times his size, was knocked to the canvas, dragged himself back up, fought that giant to an exhausted standstill, and then walked out of the arena, battered and bleeding, but on his own 2 feet and still his own master. There is a kind of greatness in all 3 of those stories, a different kind in each, but greatness in war is measured in the thing that was actually done, under fire when it counted, not in the thing that might have been done under conditions that never arrived. And what Finland actually did, no one else in the north came remotely close to matching. That is the honest verdict, and I will state it without hedging. Sweden, the undefeated unknown, possibly the strongest, forever untested. Norway, the heroic defeated, brilliant in flashes, beaten in the field, redeemed at sea and in the shadows. And Finland, the proven survivor, the small nation that fought the largest army on earth twice and lived and is therefore, by the only measure that finally counts in war, the best of the 3. But here is what keeps this argument genuinely alive and why serious historians still turn it over and disagree about it. Change the circumstances and the answer might change with them. Drop the intact, well-equipped, professional Swedish army of 1943 into the forests of the Winter War in Finland's place against the Soviet flood, and who is truly prepared to say what it would have done. Give the Norwegian army of 1940-20 more years of proper funding and a single week of clear warning before the morning in the fjord, and perhaps Oscarsborg becomes the rule rather than the breathtaking exception. The verdict that history actually handed down was shaped at least as much by the war each nation was forced to fight, or spared from fighting, as by the quality of the soldiers who would have done the fighting. Finland was great in part because Finland was given the chance, the terrible chance, to prove it. Sweden was denied that chance, and a denied chance is not the same as a failed one. And that, in the end, is the real lesson hiding inside this comparison. The thing worth carrying away from it. An army is never just its soldiers, or its guns, or its budget on paper. It is the collision between what a nation chose to build in the years of peace and what history then chose to demand of it in the hour of war. Norway built far too little and was then asked for absolutely everything all at once on a quiet morning in April. Sweden built quietly and seriously and was then asked for almost nothing and survived precisely because the question was never put to it. And Finland built something that no budget line can capture, A bond between an army and its own frozen land and its own stubborn people so deep that when history demanded the impossible of it, not once but 3 times over in 5 years, it somehow, against every reasonable expectation, found a way to give it. If this story gripped you, do me a favor and like the video and subscribe to the channel, because we go digging through these forgotten and misunderstood corners of the Second World War every single week. And there is always far more to the story than the textbooks ever bothered to tell you. And now I genuinely want to hand the argument over to you, because this is one of the great unsettled debates in military history, and your voice belongs in it. If you had to stand in a frozen northern forest in the winter of 1940 with one of these 3 armies at your back, the proven and unbreakable Finns, the unfought and unknown Swedes, or the brave and broken Norwegians, which would you choose to have beside you and why? Make your case down in the comments. I read them, and I will tell you honestly that the best arguments are the ones that change my mind. And when you have made your choice, go watch the next video already waiting for you on screen, because what one of these armies pulled off in the dark that morning is something you are simply not going to believe.